The long-standing issue of squatting on illegal land acquisition dominated Jamaican news after the government demolished several houses in Clifton, Bernard Lodge, St. Catherine on October 6. The day before the demolition, the Prime Minister told the Parliament that a situation of national importance was developing on parts of the land as criminals were apparently taking over. But does that justify the demolition action taken? Was it done legally? And if so, why the post-demolition attempt to help those in breach? Hi, I'm Herman Green, and this is PTN Plus. Thanks for joining us. Now, there's been raging debate about the legality of the demolition exercised by the government. While some say the government has the right to secure property owned by the state, there have been arguments, including from the parliamentary opposition, suggesting that the move is unconstitutional and therefore legal action may be taken by the persons who were building. To get a better understanding of the situation, we are talking with attorney at law Clive Monroe. Clive, welcome to PTN Plus.
Greetings, Herman.
All right, first of all, unconstitutional, that's the term a lot of persons are using. Was this move by the government a constitutional breach?
It's hard to say. First of all, it depends on what it is that they're saying is breached. Constitutionally, there's a right to property. But that right to property is subject, of course, to all of the laws that govern property. So the laws that govern property, of course, also dictate how it is that you own it. So in this circumstance, the legal owner, if these are registered lands, and they seem to be registered lands, so the legal owner is the government of Jamaica through either the Commission of Lands, the Ministry of Housing, or through this particular SCJ. I believe it is SCJ.
That's right.
As a body corporate, as an executive agency. So in the context of that, the rights remain to be seen as to what they are first, before you can demonstrate that they have been breached, because the legal right in ownership is with the person who is reflected on title. So if that ownership is with the state, is with this agency, then that agency is the one that is the owner.
Right.
Now, if somebody has some other right, an equitable right, or some other permission or license, then it depends on the nature of that right as it relates to the legal right. That is why the information seems to be so discordant, because there are parts of the information that lend itself towards pure squatting, and then there are parts of the information that lend itself towards some permissible settlement, if one can call it that. In other words, some permission to occupy towards formalization of legal ownership through some form of subdivision or splintering from a bigger title. So I think a part of it is that you need more information to begin with. And then the second part is to figure out, once you know where these people stand in law, whether or not those rights have been breached.
All right, I want to go back to what the Prime Minister said before the demolition exercise. This was the day before October 5. Now, basically, he said, he outlined to Parliament the reasons for the action. He pointed out that a criminal situation was developing there. Let's listen to what the Prime Minister had to say then.
The National Security Council, in reviewing the development plan, observed an insidious and growing threat in the area where alleged gangsters were capturing lands in the area adjoining the Clifton community, creating their own informal subdivision and selling these lands under the false pretense of ownership or building on them themselves. The SCJ has given warning and served notice to cease and desist. The capturing and illegal construction has continued to the point where some 30 structures have been identified. Let me be clear. The government wants every Jamaican to be able to own their own home and a piece of Jamaica. But it must be done orderly and lawfully. This illegal capturing and building on public or private land will not be tolerated. Madam Speaker, tomorrow the government will act to demolish those structures.
So, Mr. Monroe, in light of the security threat that Mr. Holness described, the legal, or rather the illegal construction and the plans that were in place for the location, they were planning to actually formalize that settlement. Those plans were there, but this construction that was going on now was in breach of all of that. Do you think, in light of that, the move to demolish was therefore legal or warranted? As a government dealing with a security threat?
If it is well, it's always a balancing exercise, isn't it? So first and foremost, you have to determine as a government, do the risks of allowing the security threat to continue to grow, to blossom, for want of a better expression, outweigh whatever equitable or other proprietary interest exists on the land, because perhaps they could have compensated them. They may have weighed that into the balance as a political discussion. I think it is so much of it is difficult, because if it is that you know that there are persons there who are there with permission from a government agency, and that permission has been evidenced, as it seems to have been the case in some instances, then that's one thing. It's another thing if you're dealing with fraud, obtaining money by false pretenses, scams, essentially. Then that's another thing entirely. Now, if you feel that, for one, there is this challenge of the criminal threat and the fact that they're taking these proceeds towards criminal activities, then it is the duty of the government to determine that. I think a part of the challenge for the government is that we tend to have this kind of dichotomous view of government in terms of administrations, but it's one government. So if it is that some of these people would have received certain assertions from one administration, which was then different under a different administration, it's still from the same government.
Right.
So to that extent, it remains to be seen how the information flows. But to the direct question, which is whether or not it was necessary, that is a question for the Prime Minister as a Chief of Defense to make that determination and to proceed from there. And if he felt that that was there and he could justify it, then he was justified in moving in that direction.
So once he can defend the move, it basically is justified.
Subject, of course, to the rights of, if these persons had no legal or proprietary rights to be there, then he would largely have been justifiable, I think, in making the move.
All right, just for a bit of clarification or more information. So we understand that the Clifton development is there on the Bernard Lodge lands, and development plans were in place for that. He's saying construction was happening on the periphery of that, just outside, adjacent to that land. And that is the area where he says the demolition has taken place. Now, this was either farmlands or a spillover land space for persons who might have been from Clifton development, who would have to be replaced, put somewhere else if their construction was not in place. So that kind of puts us to the location that has been demolished and why that part was demolished. However, I want to look at something a bit different. Now, while we say the government can defend the land owned by the state, this was done less than, if not 24 hours after he made the declaration. Person saying with the government having like 60 years to maintain or keep ownership of any property, that this 24-hour move was not necessary. What is your view on that?
You mean the alacrity?
Yes.
That is something that it seems has not yet been fully described or fully explained by the Prime Minister as to whether it is that it was only the security threat and the extent and immediacy of the threat that required this action. Because if the truth be told, the action did seem a little bit, from a political perspective, a little bit heavy-handed, given the shortness of time. I don't think it is reasonable, even in a democratic state, that the state will tell you absolutely everything. But I do think that there are some things that they can explain to justify these actions in a democratic state. To the question of the alacrity itself, there is, in a pure legal sense, actually not great need for notice when you're dealing with squatters, pure squatters. Because they have no proprietary rights on the land, then you can dislodge them, in fact, under Jamaican law, using reasonable force to that extent through means that we nominally call self-help.
Right.
Now, dealing with a government that is a representative of people, including those same people to be dislodged, some of the considerations become a little bit softer. And I think that is where a lot of people had challenges with how it is that they had proceeded. Because if it is that they had proceeded in a manner that seemed to have been more engaged, um, been more appreciative of the potential for equitable rights that persons may have, for example, for compensation for having built there while the government saw them building but having done nothing about it, then under those circumstances, it might have been better to engage them and settle it. But of course, as the government has said, and we have to take them as it is now, we have no other information. They have said that the security threat was there. So if the security threat was there, then they had to move immediately and with alacrity.
All right.
As I say, yes, go ahead.
Well, I just said with the quick movement of these persons who are described as squatters, basically, the opposition is now saying they have grounds to take legal action. What do you say
Depends
about
on
that?
what that action is.
What
Depends on
could
what
they
the
possibly
action is.
take action on?
You can always take action. The question is whether you'll be successful in taking that action. To my mind, if you're, there are levels to everything. So if you're dealing with like the people who were actually formally settled, they would be on a higher level than persons who simply just came there and squatted. Now, there is a space in law for a person who erects a structure in a context where the owner has view of it, could see the structure, and then comes and demolishes it, that a court can say that in fairness, the owner, meaning the legal owner, the one who is registered and titled,
Right.
should compensate the person who was on that property. So to that extent, that makes sense to me. To the deeper question as to whether or not international law has been violated, I don't know if I personally go that far, but I can certainly understand the compensation basis of it, if the facts remain as they are now.
All right. After the demolition, Mr. Holness went to the location to meet with some of the people who were building. Interestingly, he did speak to meeting with them after the demolition before he ordered the demolition in Parliament. Here again is what he said in Parliament the day before.
Where, Madam Speaker, we see extenuating circumstances, and I'm going to be as vague as possible, because there will always be circumstances. We are not an evil government. We are not an unthinking and uncaring government. We care. So, Madam Speaker, after we have demolished the incomplete structures, then, Madam Speaker, we will engage a process to deal with the structures that are complete and occupied. But to be clear, they will not be allowed to stand.
My question, though, is, having said this before and acting on it after, does this suggest that he knew how would you say? I don't want to say that he knew that some persons were there not as criminals, not illegally? Would you think that this would actually put him in a position to raise questions about his actions or the government's actions?
I suppose with the passage of time, we'll find out what he knew, when he knew it, and how he knew it. Some of that information is not yet in the public domain and might be the subject of constitutional tests as to whether or not they were properly done in the public interest and so on, the same security threat analysis. So it remains to be seen. For me, if it is that he had got sufficient information, the about turn seemed a little bit odd. Because if you had the information and you had weighed it, then you would simply just say, well, I'm presuming anyway, you would simply just say, well, I am here, I understand the challenge that you're having. If you fall within the class, we'll compensate you and go from there, as opposed to, oh, we didn't know that some of these people were there, or an allusion towards that latter class of persons. But if it is that it was done and then you hear about it, meaning that you didn't get all the information that you should have had from before, then now you have to deal with the legal ramifications of that, which is that sums are invested that the government would or should have known because they were there in plain sight. And so there is some compensation there, depending on the nature of the injuries to that private property, separate and apart from the construction itself or the items, whether persons were injured. I haven't heard any reports of that, but if those kind of things might lend themselves towards certain constitutional challenges, but I suspect it is more likely than not to end in some form of compensation, likely agreed between the parties.
All right. On a fundamental basis now, do you think the whole issue of persons squatting to eventual ownership over the decades, if not, decades before, that has helped enforce this belief that squatting is okay? To what extent do you think that has contributed to it? And the Prime Minister did say there is a correct way to go about buying land, and persons should take this as an example and not be duped by scammers who tell you that they're selling land with one simple receipt. To what extent do you think that has contributed, and do you think this will be a turning point in terms of squatting?
Well, let's start with the first part, because the question almost alludes to this question in the context of an independent Jamaica. But if we look at Jamaica historically, I mean, Runaway Bay, the name is indicative. Slaves were running away from there. A part of how our history has developed through escaped slaves, through people trying to get land, Jamaica, in some instances, is sparsely populated because of that kind of squatting. And the laws that surround that, particularly the laws of adverse possession, really are deemed to be focused more on use. So if the land is not in use and someone can find a productive use for the land, then over a passage of time, undisturbed, unmolested, the person can claim some legal interest in that land. So that is where we start from historically with squatting. Now, in the more modern context, squatting has become more pervasive because of urbanization, moving towards jobs, which are in larger cities. You see it in urban settlements in Kingston, you see it in Montego Bay, you see it now around the bounds of Portmore as an expanding metropolis of its own. So people will do it, and it's been tolerated in large part by political elements because they have found that it is a way to build bases, to get votes, and so on, and to move people. Dare I say, there might even be an element of gerrymandering in some of this, that you can move and remove people from stronger and stronger to weaker and vice versa areas. So there are all manner of elements that have come with this socially, politically going forward. And we now have a culture that embeds it. The problem now for the government is that now they have to pay the tax, if you will, the consequences of that. Because the problem with informal settlements is that they're not subject to the formal planning process. So you can't get in roads, lights, water, light infrastructure in the same way, garbage collection.
Right.
So you end up with an area that cannot properly appreciate because it cannot properly grow. It was not made to grow. It was made to solve an immediate problem. And that problem has now created a much larger social problem. As it relates to the second question about a lesson to the wise, he's right. And in a way, and this might sound cynical of me, I kind of find these things to be a little bit inevitable. And the reason why I say that is that in a context of a construction boom, where you need a lot of housing because there's a desperate demand for affordable and sustainable housing, people would do desperate things. And many times with policy, you hear the top end of the policy, but when the message trickles down, people don't understand what it means to them in a practical context. So for most Jamaicans, yes, it's time to build. So find somewhere, go out and build. It is curious to me as a juxtaposition that the young lady who captured the hearts and minds of the public with her purchase of this lot for 800,000, that price is roughly about 1/10 of the price of the properties that are being sold lawfully by the Housing Association of Jamaica, probably about a mile up the road from there. And I found the juxtaposition interesting because of the fact that if I can't get access to credit, if I can't get access to some of these affordable units being built, do I desperately then set up and just say, well, wherever I can get it and try from there? So that is an entire discussion by itself. But I also noticed when she was amidst her tears and her great distress at having lost her investment, I didn't hear any mention of any real estate professional. I never heard any mention of any lawyer. I never heard any mention of her having visited any entity of the National Land Agency.
Right. Which brings me to my final question. What should we be looking for as citizens in terms of buying land, property, housing, whatever it is? What should we really
Find
be
the
looking
right
for and doing?
professionals. The short answer is find the right professionals. Find attorneys, find realtors, find surveyors, find government entities that deal with these things, the National Land Agency and its various subdivisions. You need to get as much information as possible. We need to become much wiser, much savvier to the process. This is a massive investment. If I told you that I can sell you some mystery juice that can make you live to 500 years if you give me $800,000, no disrespect, with the analogy, you would tell me that I'm crazy. Why would you believe it for land? You have to go through the processes, make yourself more knowledgeable about these processes. The information is at large. There are entities that make it their duty to give you this information. There are attorneys available. And as I said, a whole host of land professionals with whom they can interact. That is the proper way forward. If it's too good to be true, if it sounds that way, it probably is. Especially in a market where the prices are going up considerably, for you to get something much cheaper than the market is usually a sign that you're being scammed.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. We have to leave it there, Attorney Clive Monroe. Now that's it for PTN Plus, where we take TVJ's primetime news reports further. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.